Welcome to another video in the Timco Retail Manager course. This course focuses on real-world application development. This is a series, so the way to get the most out of it is to start from the beginning and watch through in order. However, if you're just interested in the topic this video covers, that's fine too. Think of this series like a bunch of Lego bricks. Each is valuable on its own, but seeing them put together is even more valuable. There is a playlist that has this entire series in it on this channel. Now in this video, we'll be configuring Swagger, which is both an API documentation tool and an API demonstration tool. Now if you're a Patreon supporter at the $5 per month level or higher, make sure you head over to the site to get the latest source code. And let's get started. So we're picking up right where we left off with our API, which is right here. And right now, what we have is just one project in a solution, and we're going to add Swagger to this project. So the first thing to do is right-click on References and say Manage NuGet Packages. We're going to browse, and I know it sounds like you'd want to search for Swagger, but the reality is there is a package that helps us implement Swagger in Web API, and it's called Swashbuckle. All right, so Swashbuckle is what we're looking for, which adds a Swagger to Web API projects. So I'm going to hit install here. All right, once that installs, what we'll have is Swagger, which is kind of like the standard, and then Swashbuckle, which is what implements the standard in Web API specifically. And we'll have a couple of things in our application that help us configure it easily. All right, so I'm gonna hit OK to the fact that yes, we are installing these. All right, so now it's installed. And if we check for updates, it does say we have 11. If I click the X, we have quite a few to be updated. So let's update everything but Bootstrap. Again, we're just starting out, so updating is not a big deal at this point. I'm not going to update Bootstrap because it does change how Bootstrap works. So I'm going to leave Bootstrap at the major version is 3. If it had a minor version update, I would do that, but I believe 3.3.7 is the latest version right now. All right, so we hit OK again to say yes, we're going to update these, and I accept on the terms. And there we go. Now, the very first thing I like to do when installing something new is just make sure it runs. Because if it doesn't run, then you don't have a whole big debugging session to figure out why your code didn't work when it's what you installed that was the problem. So let's just make sure this works and it runs and that nothing needs to be changed. And that's it. Now what we're going to do to actually see Swagger would be to go /Swagger. And it's actually already running. So this is Swagger as it is, out of the box, no changes, just Swagger. All right. In the upper left here, it says Swagger UI. And then we have accounts and values. So there's values and there's accounts. Now what this is our documentation. So if you want to look at what the values controller had for endpoints, let's minimize that one for now. You can see it has 5 endpoints: a get, a post, a delete, another get, and a put. And of course, our values endpoint is kind of like Microsoft's sample out of the box. It kind of shows what can be done, even though it returns nonsensical information. It's just dummy information or demo information. So if I click on the get right here, it says this is what's going to happen. It's going to return this type of structure. And you can hit try it out, which is cool, except for the fact that when you do that, it says, I can zoom in a little bit on this text. Let's do that. It says authorization has been denied for this request. Remember that all of the values controller is protected by that authorize attribute, which says you have to be logged in order to call this API. So that's kind of a bummer. We can't just try it right out of the gate. But don't worry, we are going to soon. We're going to fix that. But that's kind of neat. It shows us what the request URL was. So if you want to copy that, you could. In fact, we could copy this and paste it into Postman and run that same command. It also shows us the headers and the response body and the response code. It's a pretty full-featured thing. And so you could actually get by without necessarily using Postman going forward for most of these basic things. Now, Postman offers a lot of extra features, including the ability to go back and rerun previous requests. This doesn't do that. But for basic stuff, and especially web-based, it really can't be beat. All right, so we're going to hide the response. We're going to close this down. One thing you'll notice in the account is there isn't anywhere to actually log in. So we have external login, which isn't really what we want. We have register, which is kind of cool. We can actually register here. And in fact, it even tells us how to. Email address, password, and confirm password. Just use that and click on it, and it goes over here. And then you just kind of fill in each section, which is pretty neat. But there is no get token. So we're going to fix that as well, because we can't really log in using the OAuth that we've set up. All right, but that's the basics of Swagger. Okay, so we just do /Swagger on the end of our URL here, and it brings up this page for us now that we have Swagger installed. And the other good news is our system works, which means we didn't break anything when we launched it. Do notice that there's now changes here to 4 different files. So if I want to commit those changes right now, I could. But I'm going to actually configure Swagger first and then commit the bundle. All right, so next we need to do is we need to tweak the configuration file. So under app start, there's now a Swagger config. And this is pretty nice, because what it allows us to do is it allows us to go through here and just uncomment things to change something. So they've kind of documented for us in a way that allows us to easily make changes. For example, calling it TRM Data Manager isn't the greatest, but it technically is the name of my API project. So let's call this Timco Retail Manager API. Now down here, if you want to print the documents, you need to enable pretty print to make them look nice. That's simple. So let's do that. Now there are other things in here that might be of value to you, but for the most part, I'm going to leave things alone. I am not going to enable this. I had a hard time getting this to work the way I wanted it to, but I found an alternative that we're going to do today. So the way it's supposed to work is you enable this and then make some other changes, and then you can have some login information on your site. But it just never worked the way I wanted it to. And so instead, we'll go ahead and add an alternate, like I said. All right, down here, if you want to enable obsolete actions, or ignore obsolete actions. So if you have an action or an endpoint that is no longer used or shouldn't be used anymore, and it's just there for legacy, then you can mark it as obsolete. And then either hide it in Swagger by enabling this line right here, or it will just be marked as obsolete but still usable in the documentation if you leave this commented out. This is one that a lot of people do, and I'm not going to do. Now the idea here is that you uncomment this line, and then you can use the XML comments that are above your method names as the documentation that Swagger pulls, which sounds great. The problem I Down here, there is another thing it's also ignore obsolete properties there, which is similar to ignoring obsolete endpoints. But right down here, we're going to enable or describe all enums as string. So if you have a enum that says car, truck, SUV, by default, Swagger would say 1, 2, or 3. I kind of wanted to say car, truck, SUV. Makes a little more sense that way, and it's easier to read. All right, so that's all in the configuration section, but there's another section down here for the UI. And this is just how we print out or how we make Swagger look good. And the only thing I'm going to change in here is the document title. So this is what goes in the tab at the top of Chrome or whatever browser you're using that kind of describes that tab. So I'm going to say Timco API. It's short, which means it's going to show up better in the tab, and it still describes the product. Now, if you had CSS, you wanted to reformat the Swagger, you could just uncomment this line right here and update where it's pointing to. Same thing with JavaScript if you want JavaScript to run on the page, and so on. You can also make some other tweaks as to showing booleans as 1 and 0 or 0 and 1 instead of false and true. But by default, it's false and true, which is what I prefer. So there's a lot in here, like I said. Most of the stuff we're going to leave alone. If you had a security policy where you didn't want to show certain things, you could limit to say only get commands or get and head commands or whatever you wanted to, and just kind of not show certain ones if you wanted to. But I really think that if your API is a true API, then people should be able to see all the endpoints. If they have permission to use them, they have permission to use them. If they don't, they don't. So, and here's the other part of that OAuth. Again, we're not going to use it this way, but we need to enable that as well if that's the way we're going to do it. Okay, so we've made some tweaks to the Swagger config file, but we're not quite done yet. We need to add that OAuth ability. And there's two different pieces I want to add. One is going to be to allow that token endpoint. So it's our URL/token, which is what we use to log into the site. I want that enabled on the Swagger documentation. And then also I want to be able to paste in the bearer token that I have in order to authorize restricted commands. I'm going to give you a URL that I got this information from. It's not from me specifically. It's actually from Stack Overflow, where a guy had the same problem and he solved his own problem, and then he posted the solution, which was great. So I will paste that URL into the first class we create, and then you can have it to refer to. But the reality is I just took the information from that, so you have everything you need. So you right click on App Start. We're going to add a new class. And let's call this, I did tweak a couple of his names and things. Let's call this class auth token operation. And it's public, which is great. And we're going to say iDocument filter. We're going to control dot on that and add a using statement for swashbuckle.swagger. So this is an interface. And this interface says we have one method in it, which is the apply method. And in here, by the way, I did that without telling you. Let's go back and do it again. So I did not yet implement the interface. Remember, an interface is a contract. We have to implement the contract in order to be in compliance. Now, I could have typed out what the contract says I'm going to do, but it's kind of easier to do this drop down here, or if you click the cursor anywhere on this word and control dot, it does the drop down and it says, the first one's implement interface, which says it will create the methods that we need. And then in each method or property, if there's properties as well, But in each method, it's going to say throw new not implemented exception, meaning, yes, you created the method, but you haven't done anything yet. So I'm going to throw an exception until you figure that out. So I'm going to go ahead and implement the interface. And now I have the one method I need for this interface. I'll delete that and put in my code instead. So swagger.paths.add. This is going to add a new path in Swagger so I can have my login screen essentially. Which that path is just /token. I have to add a new path item. And then in here, I'm going to say post equals new operation. So what this is doing is saying, okay, here's the path, and it's got a post command. And then in here, we're going to say tags equals new list of string. We're going to say auth. And that identifies, this is the auth category essentially. Consumes equals new, list of string. And don't worry if you don't understand all this. Really, it's just a matter of copy and paste if you want to. I'm choosing to type it out because I don't really like to copy and paste too much because then I go too fast and you kind of miss what I'm doing and what the context is. So consumes application /x-www-form-URL encoded. That sound familiar? That's the type of the body that we have to send this command for the post for token. All right, and parameters equals new list of parameter. And we're going to say new parameter. And in there, we're going to say the type equals string. And the name equals grant underscore type. And the required equals true. And the @in equals form data. Okay, so this is a parameter that's going to be passed to the token method. There's actually 3 parameters. I'm going to go ahead and just copy this format. And I'll paste it 2 more times with a comma in between. And each is a string, but this one is username. This one is password. All right. The username and password are not required, although it's kind of silly if we don't actually use them. And all 3 are form data. Okay, we're missing a semicolon right there. And now this is complete. So this is a new document filter that says, I want you to add one new route called /token. I want you to put it in the auth category. The command is a post command, and the type of data you're going to be sending, the parameters, should come through as application /x-www-form-URL encoded. And oh, by the way, here is the definition for the 3 parameters. Why do we have a definition? Because on the actual page, there'll be a box we have to fill in for grant type, username, and password. Now, there's a couple discrepancies here. I think originally we called this command as a get command, but it's looking like the author here is saying that it's the post command, not a get command. I'm not positive right now, so I'm going to find out in a minute. That's one thing I'll look into. The other is the grant type is always password, for our system at least. And I believe if we do this, I believe there's a option for @default. So I'm going to say password. and see if that comes in as default, because that would save us typing that out every time. All right, so that solves that problem. Well, mostly. Now we need to take this and actually apply it. So you go to Swagger config, which is the Swagger config in the app_start right here. And I do it at the very top. It doesn't really matter where you do it because this is not an ordered thing for the most part. In this case, it doesn't matter. So I'm going to say c.document filter and say auth token operation. I hit control dot and add the using statement for trm data manager.appstart. And now I can just open, close parens, and semicolon. And that's it. What this does is it says, okay, add a document filter of type auth token operation. So it's adding a new filter to Swagger and basically saying, run this class, which has that apply method. So now if we do just this, and we hit start, it's going to load up our API. And as soon as it's done, I'm going to hit /swagger and look for that third entry. And there we go. We have auth right here, which has one post method. Yep, it is post. And it says /token. If I click on it, the default is filled in. That's kind of nice. And now I can fill in my username and password. I believe my username is tim@iamtimcorey.com. My password is pwd12345 period. And let's hit try it out. It's thinking about it, and the response is, yep, that worked. Notice the 200 response right there, which indicates that it was successful. And the response body is, here is your access token. So if you actually copy that down and can access my system, you can run my API and log in as me. Of course, you have my username and password too. But it says, okay, there's your token. There's your username. Here's when it was issued. Here's when it expires. That's about 2 weeks away. And that's the expires in time, which I believe is in seconds, but I'm not positive. It's 1.2 million, which seems about right. Maybe it's milliseconds. Okay, so now we have a working version of the token, which is great because now we can have that authorization. It's right here, which we need first before we can call any of our methods in the value controller. The problem is I have no place to put that here. So that's what we're going to tackle next. Let's close this out. And I did say I was going to put the path that Stack Overflow post in here. So there it is. There's the actual post. For those of you who do not get the source code, you can actually pause the video right here and read off the URL. It's a little bit longer, or you can Google it. But I am going to make some modifications to this, like I did in this one. I'm also going to modify the next one as well. All right, so let's go ahead and add the next file, which if we right click on app_start and say add new class, let's call this class authorization operation filter. And it's public already, which is excellent. And now add a semicolon after, or a colon, I'm sorry, after the end and say operation filter control dot, add the using statement for swashbuckle.swagger. And now control dot again to implement the interface, which is just that one apply method. And now you make a modification in here. So what this is going to do is add a parameter to every operation. So we're going to start off with saying if operation dot parameters equals null. So some operations, like the initial get command, which is basically get everything, it doesn't have parameters because it's getting everything. The problem there is there's no parameters, therefore the list is null, not just empty. And this is one of the tweaks I made from the solution in Stack Overflow, is he checked to see if it was not null and then added an extra parameter. I want to check to see if it's null and make it not null, because I want the parameter always, even on methods that don't require any parameters. So operation.parameters. Now if you mouse over it, it's an iList of type parameter. So you can say equals new list of type parameters, or type parameter, I'm sorry. Now you can't do a new iList because an iList is an interface, not an implementation. A list is an implementation of iList. Now that we are sure that this parameter is actually instantiated and is not null, we can now use it. So operation.parameters.add new parameter, that's what it takes. And we have name equals authorization at in equals header. So that's where we're going to put this parameter. Description equals access token. That's what's going to show up in our documentation for it. Required equals false, because some methods don't need authorization. And type equals string. Add our semicolon at the end. And now we have an operation filter. So just like before, we're going to come over here, once we save this, come over here and add a new filter. This time, this is in the Swagger config, this time c.operation filter, and it's authorization operation filter. And again, just add it with empty parens and a semicolon at the end. Now what we've done is add two filters to Swagger. One to add that token endpoint, and one to allow for an extra parameter on every single method that allows us to put the token in. So let's run this and see how it works. Once we're done here, we'll go ahead and put our /swagger at the end. And now if we look at values and look at the get command, notice there is now parameters and it says authorization. And that's the access token, and it goes in the header. This is all things we did in Postman, but in Postman we had to actually say, okay, this is the header and it's an authorization parameter, and then the value is bearer space the actual token. So we can do it a little bit more easily now by just pasting it in here, pasting our token in here with the word bearer in front of it. So let's go to auth, go to token, type in my username and password. My password, pwd 12345, period. Try it out. Grab this token here, not the double quotes, but everything else, and copy it. Control C. Now I can minimize that. Go to values. Remember, if we hit try it out, it says authorization has been denied for this request. But if I come here to my authorization and type bearer space and then paste in that token. So bearer, then a white space, one space, and then the token itself. And hit try it out again. Notice the response body has actually 3 values. value 1, value 2, and this value right here, which we added in the last lesson to identify who we are. Just get our ID. So now you can make the same call for any of the other calls. So for example, the get for API/values/ID, which it needs an ID, which doesn't really matter because it's a dummy thing. It's a demo. So, and then bearer space in our token. Now notice that this one goes in the header. This one goes in the path. Because it actually goes values / in this case 5. So it puts these things in different spots. Hit try it out. And now you see the response body is value and the response code is 200, meaning it worked. And there's the actual URL we called. Now again, if I didn't have this bearer here, and I hit try it out, it says authorization has been denied. I'm not logged in for that particular call. So let's try that again. It's always good to learn these things early on. So double quotes around test, and let's just put test 1, 2, 3, just so we have something. And hit try it out. And now if you mouse over it or look down here for value, it says test 1, 2, 3. So it did come through as our value being posted. And of course, it's a 204, meaning it succeeded, but there's nothing to come back. And if you look down here, no content in the body. All right, so that's the call it made, and it made a post call, and the result was no content, but we saw that it did actually send our data to the API. So let's zoom back out here. So that's Swagger. Let's go to list of operations. That's Swagger. It allows us to document our API because it's very easy to see what the different endpoints are and how to call them. It also allows us to try out our API and see how it works. So if you want to give this to a customer, probably on a demo server, probably not your live API, but if you gave it to a customer on the demo server and said, hey, go ahead and try the different endpoints and see how they work, they could actually run Swagger and just see immediately all the different endpoints, what data they take, and how to fill them in. So this is great information. Having this much information on API is amazing. So even something as simple as this, click on it, fill it in, you can now register a new account. This is how you can actually create your admin account easily. You create this and then you just go ahead and promote it behind the scenes. But this way you don't have to create it manually for yourself. All right, so this is a really valuable tool. However, like I said, maybe you don't want to put this in production. So maybe you want to have this in development, but you don't want to give people access to the full thing in production because it's a little scary. I get that, although I do think this probably should be in production. But because anything you have access to do in the API, you also should have access somewhere in an application to do. So it's kind of on the user to do what they should with what they have access to. But if you say, you know what, I really don't want to give them access to this for production, you have a couple options, but the easiest one that I have found is in the Swagger config file, the very top, there's one line on line 7 that says this is a pre-application start method. Comment that out. If you comment that out, then what happens is Swagger goes away. So we're starting this back up with that line commented out. And if I type /swagger, I get a 404. Can't find that endpoint. It's gone. Now, depending on your application, depending on how you're deploying it, it probably doesn't make sense to wrap that in just comments whenever you're deploying to your production, but then uncomment it for development. So what you can do is actually wrap this in a pre-compiler statement that looks to see if it's in debug mode or debug compiling version. And if it is, then go ahead and keep it. And if it's not, ignore it. In which case, Swagger never gets brought into production. And yet with the same build, you just build it in a different version, debug versus release, or you can have different versions as well. Then it's either on or off depending on which environment it's going to. So, but just so you know, that's an easy way to take it in and out without having to change your entire system. You can either turn your documentation on or off. Now, I would contend you'd always want it to be on somewhere because of the fact that your customers or whoever is consuming your API, even if it's you, can take the Swagger configuration and they can actually run it through some different tools to create some really cool stuff. One of the things that the Swagger UI can do is actually generate your code for you to call the API. So running, and we're going to leave it running all the time. It doesn't really matter for our application. I want to leave it on all the time. So now that we're done, we go to Team Explorer, select all the different things that have been added, and hit Stage. Now, if I'm not sure about something, I do want to inspect each of these and make sure, like, okay, authorization operation filter, auth token operation, yep. Swagger config, sure. Packages.config, if I remember, that's the one where I updated some NuGet packages. And of course, they're now updated. CSproj gets changed. We have some added files. Web config, not sure what was going on there, so let's double click that. And because we're in the changes area, to double click it, it shows us the version differences between the two. So we have what's at head, which what head means is that's where we started from, the committed change, the last committed change. And so this is the old file essentially, and it's got these versions right here, which we can scroll. And the newest version was 4.0.0.0. We've now changed that to 4.0.1.0 for both there and for the new version. And a similar thing for these other four as well. Basically updated some packages. Now also notice on the right here, that shows us, okay, that's red means it's been removed. Green means it's been added. In this case, because we actually swapped them out, what we did, or just changed a line. Yes, this is good to be staged and committed. They're already staged. So now I'm going to say add Swagger documentation to API. Adds swashbuckle / Swagger to the API for documentation and testing. Now I did a line return here because this is shorter than 80 characters, but I didn't know how much shorter. And if I move that out, it would go back. But I want to keep 80 characters as about the max for my length of line. So I just hit enter and did another line. So commit staged. And that just commits it locally, not up to GitHub. So now I have to go here to sync, either going sync right there, or by clicking the blue link. Either way, now I want to fetch my changes to see if there's any changes on GitHub that I didn't know about, which there's not. And then I hit push, or I can hit sync to do a pull and then a push. Since there's no changes, I don't need to do a pull first. Therefore, I'll just hit push. And that pushes my latest changes up to GitHub. And with that, we're done with this project. Not with this Visual Studio project, but with this particular task that we had to do, which was to add Swagger into Web API. Now, coming up next, we're going to set up our SQL database project. So that's the next video in the series. Make sure to check it out once you've done this work in your own copy of your API.